Dear students, today we are here to learn about the maritime trade of early medieval India. Now, while trade was flourishing in a rich network in the Indian Ocean in the early medieval period, we need to learn about the place of India and the role of Indian traders within this. Now, the key to understanding the maritime trade of early medieval India is to grasp the broader context of Indian Ocean trade in this period. Now, the Indian Ocean had long served as a broad avenue of trade where various communities participated, from the Chinese to the kingdoms of Southeast Asia to Ceylon to India to the Arab traders and to the people of the East African continent. But for the period in question, certain changes appeared in the configuration of this trade. Noted historian K.N. Choudhury has remarked that two events, the founding of the Tang dynasty in China in 618 CE and then the departure of the Prophet Muhammad from Mecca to Medina in 622 CE, which signaled the rise of Islamic Arabian dominance in Western Asia, signaled that the eventual union between the trade of the Eastern and Western Indian Ocean in one grand chain of transoceanic trade. This new broader pattern of trade would extend from the ports of China through Southeast Asia to India to Ceylon, across the Arabian Sea to the Arabian Peninsula and the ports of East Africa. While the Chinese were initially novices at this trade, it is interesting to note that they later increased their volume and their competitiveness. In fact, Chinese participation in Indian Ocean trade persisted to the 12th century, even though it was disrupted occasionally due to periods of political disunity or crisis. Along with the Chinese, other trading communities like the Indonesians, the Indian traders, the Ceylonese traders, and the Arabian traders also participated in the Indian Ocean trade. The Arabian traders were especially dominant, and as early as the 8th century, they were pushing their influence westwards. Only in the 10th century did they face stiff competition from Southeast Asian traders, and in the 12th century, the Chinese again tried to push them away and establish dominance in Malabar. In this connection, we should note that many reporters talked about the great size of the Chinese ships, which were bigger, safer, and in the long term, the Chinese knowledge of navigation and skill in trade was definitely improving. Therefore, it becomes clear that while the world of Indian Ocean trade was rich and dynamic, Indian traders who wanted to participate in this trade network faced stiff competition from numerous well-established groups. Now, the question rises about what was the condition of Indian Ocean trade. To answer this, we must look at the trade relations of India with various areas of the Indian Ocean. Firstly, we must look at relations with China. Indo-Chinese trade relations can be divided into two phases. One phase of active trade culminated around the middle of the 8th century. Chinese reports dated around 749 CE mention that the river and the ports of Canton were frequently visited by Indian merchants and even claimed that the temples had been built there for visiting Indians. The second phase of Indo-Chinese trade would culminate sometime around the 12th century. Now, these trade relations were often initiated through active state intervention in the form of embassies. In the 7th century CE, we find mention of various Indian ambassadors in China, including representatives from the Chalukyas. Chinese accounts note embassies sent from them in 692 CE and a representative from the Pallav king Narasimhavarman II in 720 CE. Arab sources also note the presence of Indian traders, including merchants from Bengal who were reportedly there to export rhino horns. Of course, Indian merchants faced stiff competition from other groups, including Arabs. And there was a marked decline in Indian trade with China in the 10th century. However, it should be noted that the activities of the kingdoms of South India, especially the Chola kingdoms, helped to maintain Indo-Chinese trade relations to an extent. Embassies were sent to China from the Cholas under the order of Rajaraj Chola and later Rajendra Chola in 1015 CE and 1033 CE respectively. There is even reference to another Chola embassy in 1077 CE. These embassies were apparently laden with luxury goods like elephant tusks, rhinoceros horns, pearls, frankincense, rosewater, camphor, brocade, etc. Chinese coins of the Sung period have been discovered in Tanjore, which testify to the enduring trade links between the two countries. So that was Chinese trade. Now we come to Indian trade links with Southeast Asia. There is extensive evidence of Indian trade links with Southeast Asia in the early medieval period. Studying texts like the Vamana and the Garuda Puranas show not just trade links but familiarity with the economy and geography of these places. One of the most significant parts of Southeast Asian trade was Tamralipto of Bengal. A number of literary sources note that voyages for present-day Indonesia often embarked from there. Not just traders, but scholars like Dharmopal or Dipankar also journeyed from here. Therefore, it can be argued from the later 8th century, the Pal kingdom of Bengal was participating in the Southeast Asian trade. And in fact, traces of their cultural influence have been found in various inscriptions as well as in architecture. So it was not just trade relations, but cultural relations as well that connected Bengal through Tamralipto to Southeast Asia. Apart from Bengal, the eastern Chalukyas were also influential in the Southeast Asian trade. Hoards of coins discovered in present-day Myanmar and Thailand indicate the presence of Chalukya traders. In fact, the traders of South India were a major presence, as is testified by an inscription from Sumatra regarding the presence of Tamil merchants. The Chola kingdom had important trade relations with Southeast Asia, and historian Upinder Singh has suggested that the naval expeditions to Malaysia and Indonesia in 1025 CE and again in the 1070s decade were part of an initiative to control trade in that region. The Tanjore inscription of Rajendra Chola I refers to a kingdom of Madamalingam, which has been tentatively identified as Tamrolingo, situated near Thailand. Chola images and pottery have been found throughout Southeast Asia, including various evidence for trade linkages. These relations were often cordial, such as the king of Sri Vijay cooperating with Rajaraj Chola in patronizing a monastery at Nagapattinam, or that same king sending gifts in favor of the temple deities of that city. King Rajendra Chola I also received gifts from the king of Khmer, which is modern-day Cambodia. The merchants who participated in this lucrative trade between South India and Southeast Asia were members of powerful guilds which became prominent from the 10th century onwards. Referred to as Samaya, these organizations were created through contracts and governed by strict codes of conduct. The most famous of these organizations was the Ayavol, also known as the Ainuravar. Ayavol meant the 500. Originally established in Aihole in Karnataka, it soon became the largest organization for merchants in South India. It even subordinated other organizations like the Manigranam under its control. These organizations were based on occupational and economic interest. Inscriptions referring to these merchants' guilds have been found in Thailand and Sumatra dating back to the 9th and the 11th centuries. Not only were guild merchants involved in Southeast Asian trade, they were also accompanied by soldiers, which testifies to the organizational power of these associations. The merchants may even have established autonomous coastal settlements for the purpose of better trade. So we can understand that Indian trade relations with Southeast Asia were rich and complex, quite multidimensional, and involved various dynasties. And now we turn to the Arab trade. Naturally, the west coast of India was more important than the east coast when it came to trade with what is now known as the Middle Eastern region. Medieval merchants and writers like Abu Zaid have mentioned the close ties between Indian merchants and ports like Siraf on the Persian Gulf. Now, such trading ties often materialized in the form of large Indian trading missions, which were prominent enough to be mentioned by local writers and chroniclers. Jewish writers mention how Indian merchants and trading missions visited ports like Kish on the Persian Gulf to sell their commodities. The famous traveler Ibn Battuta has mentioned that Indian merchants from a variety of coastal cities like Mangalore and Calicut travelled to Aden on the Red Sea, and that this trade was important enough for them to set up a colony there. Indian sources also mention Hormuz being a center of trade, much frequented by Indians. However, it should be remembered that this Indian trade with the Middle East was geographically limited. Indian merchants visited Basra, Kish, Siraf, and Hormuz, but did not venture further west. Clearly, trade with Egypt and the African coast was still controlled by the Arab traders. Now, the Arab traders were also visiting Indian ports, and they were sufficiently influential and important enough to actually play a role in local politics, including a dispute between a Chalukya minister and the ruler of a neighboring state. The Rashtrakuta dynasty favored the Arab traders as well. From a Jewish source, it becomes clear that many of the Indian rulers accorded the highest importance to Arab trade and Arab traders. These traders were met by royal civil servants who noted down their names and extended royal protection to them and their trade commodities. Even the markets in which they traded were supervised by royal ministers, and any items which were misplaced or lost were returned to the trader after verification of his identity. There are also detailed reports about coastal rulers levying duties and license fees and extending protection to coastal shipping in exchange. Thus, we can understand that the Arab traders were not just an economic force, but they also were starting to develop political ties and political influence. Now that we have discussed Indian trade relations with the various parts of the Indian Ocean, we turn to the various ports of trade. Numerous ports of India played important role in overseas trade. In Bengal, first Tamralipto and Shaptagram were important ports for Southeast Asian trade. Now, if we proceed along the east coast down from Bengal, Puri, Kalingapattam, Banpur, and Rameshwar were all mentioned as being important ports. The Coromandel coast of South India played a major role in overseas trade, and trade goods from both the east and from the west arrived here. Important ports along the Coromandel coast were Kaveripattanam, Nagapattanam, Devipattanam, etc. On the west coast in Malabar, Quilon was a principal port not just for exchange of goods but also for resupply of ships. It was the principal embarkation point for Oman and also a place for transshipment of the Chinese traders. That is, it was here that the Chinese changed ships to continue to trade with the West. Quilon was thus extremely prosperous as goods from Southeast Asia, China, and Arabia all entered its markets. There were, of course, other ports on the west coast like Calicut and Mangalore. Further north, if we proceed along the west coast, in Gujarat, Cambay, Broach, and Somnath were important ports. Famous historian of ancient India, Romila Thapar, has remarked upon an Arabian trading presence in Somnath. Further west was situated Debal at the mouth of the Indus River. This was another port where Arabian, Indian, and Chinese traders congregated. According to a contemporary source, it had a flourishing market, excellent port facilities, and even a fort for protection of the port and trade. Now that we have discussed the basic geographical situation of the ports, we need to look at the content of the trade. To do this, we will be looking at export and import commodities. Now, among exports, India was prized by Arab traders as a source of valuable trade goods. Contemporary chronicles have left behind detailed records and lists of trade that we can peruse through for details. So we know that perfumed goods like camphor, aloe, amber, musk, sandalwood, precious jewels like pearls of various types and sizes, diamonds, corals, plant-based goods like medicinal herbs, vegetables, coconuts, spices like nutmeg and cloves, textiles like high-quality cotton, and animal products like ivory were all part of this luxury export trade. Several sources mention the very high volume of spices, precious metals, stones, and ivory exported from India to the West. There was even regional variety when it came to exports. So, Sindh, for example, exported bamboos and canes. Gujarat exported indigo and dyed cotton goods, as well as spices like pepper and ginger. The Rashtrakuta dynasty's ports exported teak wood, which was regarded as very valuable. Now, this was exports mainly to the West, to Arabian countries. If we look at exports to China, they were more varied. Rhinoceros horn, elephant tusks for ivory, animal skins, furs, and pelts from animals like leopards, lions, sables, camels, and marmots, tortoiseshell goods, metal goods like gold, silver, copper, iron, lead, and tin, agricultural products like sugar cane, sugar, pepper, ginger, sandalwood, and other aromatic goods, black salt, embroidered rugs, muslin cloth, and precious stones like diamonds were all being exported to China. Other sources also mention aloe woods and a variety of spices being among export goods. So we understand from here that India had a very rich export trade. But now we must turn our attention to imports. India imported a large amount of things from various foreign countries. Firstly, we should look into the Western imports. Incense was imported from the Middle East, especially from southern Arabia. Copper, lead, salt were all imported also from Arabia. Dates were imported from Basra into Debal. And African ivory was also imported from Zanzibar, which was on the African coast, via Oman. Dyes and mineral oil from Persia also fall into the list of imports. And from Egypt, emeralds and special types of coral and other precious stones. Now, a major item of import from the West was horses. And this horse trade gained in importance over time. Horses were a mainstay in warfare and for the use of chiefs and kings as status symbols. Moreover, due to lack of knowledge regarding the correct breeding of Arabian horses in India, it was often necessary to import very large numbers of horses. This trade was naturally extremely lucrative. A contemporary source mentions a Pandya king paying 220 dinars of gold per horse, and the total volume of trade was estimated as being above 10,000 horses. So clearly this was a very, very valuable trade commodity. A large volume of gold was pouring out from India to Arabia as part of this horse trade. Now, that was mainly the importation trade from Arabia to India. If we look at this trade from direction of China, the principal import good from China to India was silk in its various forms. Chinese silk textiles are mentioned by travelers, chroniclers, and even in Indian literary texts, which signify that to their importance and also to how widely they were being used. Along with silk, gold, silver, iron, and tin were all being imported. In 1296, the Chinese government actually prohibited the export of gold and silver to India, which testifies to the pre-existing high volume of trade in precious metals. From the countries of Southeast Asia, India imported silk, porcelain, camphor, rhubarb, beeswax, sandalwood, cloves, cardamom, and other spices. Apart from these luxury goods, agricultural commodities like areca nuts, betel nuts, coconuts, plantain, different types of fruits and herbs were all imported. Gold, silver, and copper were also chief items of import. The islands of Southeast Asia were in fact famous for their gold mines and their gold trade, often being referred to as Suvarnadip or Golden Islands in the literary sources of India in this period. The ubiquity of these precious metals and the high value of this trade has been remarked upon repeatedly by writers, historians, and travelers. Now, it should be noted that this trade was slow and not very safe. In fact, it is quite safe to say it was rather dangerous. The sailing ships had to brave oceanic storms and pirates, and long distance trade thus constituted a major risk for merchants. Thus, in order for this trade to be worth the investment, it was comprised almost entirely of high value luxury items, which would return high profit in terms of trade upon sale. It is difficult to estimate the exact quantity or volume of this trade, though from what descriptions are available in the contemporary sources, it appears to have been considerable. Thousands of pearls, hundreds of elephant tusks, etc., were being traded for huge quantities of gold and silver. I have already remarked upon the large number of horses being traded. However, all such descriptions must be regarded with a certain degree of skepticism, as exaggeration from writers can never entirely be ruled out. In conclusion, it needs to be stated that the balance of trade at this time was leaning away from India, with imports far exceeding exports. Indian merchants appeared to have been more content with internal trade, and more external trade and its control was being handed over to foreign traders like the Arabs. Rather than earning considerable quantities of bullion, that is precious metals, to trade, India seemed on the whole to be exporting gold and silver out of the country for expensive items of trade, like the horses. Therefore, to sum up, India in the early medieval period had trade relations all across the Indian Ocean, from China to Southeast Asia, extending all the way west to Arabia. Powerful consortiums of Indian merchants established trading colonies, while influential foreign traders like the Arabs also had considerable influence in India. Trade, which flowed into and out of the numerous ports dotted across both the eastern and western coasts, comprised of luxury items, and overall balance of trade was not in India's favor. However, India continued to occupy a very important position in this flourishing network of trade in the early medieval period. Thank you.